Back in the 70s and 80s, the biggest frustration was actually settling land claims. Going and fighting it out with those people that didn't want us to have our own say. Now we've transitioned over, and this panel will discuss the next thorny issue. I've heard this message by speakers as we started out today, but it was a message that I said as chief to every federal official that I could speak to. And I want you to know that it was reaffirmed at an LCAC meeting with the Prime Minister about 6 years ago, where 2.0 Trudeau said the greatest path to reconciliation is actually through the settling and the implementation of the modern land claim and self-government agreements. And I always said to the people that would listen to me, implement our claims, implement our agreements, because that has become the new sore point for a lot of us. Champagne-Ajac First Nation on May 29th will have celebrated 30 years of self-government. And we are still having to fight the fight to have the other governments recognize us. When we talk about systemic change, that's where all of our problems lie. People still want to follow the policies and procedures that were laid out back in the 18 and early 1900s to how to deal with the Indian, Métis, or Inuit problem. Needed to get us out of the bush, they say, and into the boardroom. Now we sit at the boardroom, and those people that we're supposed to be talking to always tell us, what is the first thing they say? We have no mandate. We have no mandate. And my advice right from the get-go, get a mandate. So we now transition over to talking about the implementation and the challenges of our implementing our many land claim and self-government agreements. We have four esteemed speakers who will be presenting their personal picture of and challenges of implementing the land claim as it perceives to their particular land claim and self-government agreement. We're honored to have Jim Aldridge of Aldridge Rosling LLP, and just flown, basically just came sliding in, I believe, Mr. Dylan Johnson from the Tla'amin government, Bertha Rebeska Zoe from the Klitschko government, and of course, Daniel Kwan Watson from CERNA. Thank you for joining us. I now turn the mic over to Mr. Aldrich, who will do the opening comments.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to see everyone, many old friends and many new. As indicated, my name is Jim Aldridge. I've spent most of my legal career working for the Nisga'a Nation in respect of first negotiating, helping the negotiating team, advising the negotiating team for the Nisga'a Treaty, and then helping with implementation since then. And I've had the great pleasure of working with colleagues from across the country under the aegis of the Land Claims Agreements Coalition, which started almost 20 years ago. It's hard to believe for those of us who were there. Almost 20 years ago, it was in November of 2003, a conference was held here in Ottawa, and the participants at the conference were the holders of every Indigenous, well, put it like this, every Indigenous nation, organization, or government that had, to that point, entered into what were called in those days, somewhat quaintly, nostalgically, comprehensive land claims agreements. And the conference brought everybody together. Of course, now we call these modern treaties with a much better name, more accurate name. The outcome of that conference was the creation of the Land Claims Agreements Coalition. And as I was looking through my files, I actually found the document that the participants signed that day. It's quite brief. I thought that I would share it. It says, the name of the conference was Redefining Relationships. Statement from the participants. It said, whereas a conference on redefining relationships was held in Ottawa November 11 to 14, 2003, with participation of all Aboriginal governments organizations that have achieved land claims agreements. Whereas the relationships established by land claims agreements, self-government agreements, are constitutional in nature. Whereas participants at the conference identified common issues and concerns relating to implementation of their land claims agreements, self-government agreements. And whereas we're committed to working together to address these common issues and concerns, we call upon the Government of Canada, and this was the fundamental point, we call upon the Government of Canada to develop a new land claims implementation policy in close consultation with Aboriginal governments and organizations who've achieved land claims agreements. Key elements of this new policy must include, number one, recognition that the Crown in right of Canada, not the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, is party to our land claims agreements, self-government agreements. Number two, there must be a federal commitment to achieve the broad objectives of the land claims agreements, self-government agreements within the context of the new relationships as opposed to mere technical compliance with narrowly defined obligations. This must include but not be limited to ensuring adequate funding to achieve these objectives and obligations. Number three, implementation must be handled by appropriate senior level federal officials representing the entire Canadian government. Number four, there must be an independent implementation audit and review committee separate from the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development. This could be the Auditor General's Department or a similar office reporting directly to Parliament. Annual reports will be prepared by this office in consultation with groups with land claims agreements. That's number four. Our Aboriginal governments and organizations are committed to working together on common implementation issues. We're committed to working together to help develop and monitor this new policy, signed November 14th, 2003. No one thought that 20 years later, we still would not have achieved those goals. Progress has been made, there's no doubt about it. And there has been, if I may say so, a wonderful bonding of relationships among the various modern treaty holders. But in terms of what this is about, it struck me as I was preparing for these talks, the word implementation is an odd word. It's kind of part of our argot. You know, we talk about implementation policy because it's like there was a negotiation policy at the time, comprehensive land claims negotiation policy. So the counterpoint was then an implementation policy, negotiation implementation. But what does it really mean? I suggest that what it really means, and we could even call it this, it's a keeping our promises policy. What we really need is a policy whereby the Crown keeps its promises. Because what was happening in 2003, and to a certain extent continues today, although things have improved, is three things. One, clear obligations were not always being met, and people were having to enter into disputes and often litigation. Number two, the objectives of agreements were not being evaluated or measured. Results against objectives wasn't being measured. And indeed, the department in those days said the best way to achieve objectives is simply to fulfill the obligations on a checklist approach. And three, there was no focus on the relationship, which is really what keeping the promises is all about, is an ongoing relationship, not merely a checklist of obligations. Well, in the years that followed, and time's limited, I won't go through all of the history, many of you know it, and many of you won't, but from 2003 through to 2005, some headway was made with the Martin government towards a memorandum of understanding that would establish the parameters for a new implementation policy. But of course, when the election happened, 2005, well, what can I say? Days of gloom followed. I won't say Sauron walked across the land, but there was a mortar-like aspect to it. Nonetheless, the coalition beavered away and did not let that stop. In 2006, the coalition crafted what became known as the 410 Declaration, which is on the website, and it's a key document in the development of history since then. There was presentation to the Senate Committee on Aboriginal Affairs that led to a report in 2008. It's the only reason I brought this is the name of the report. It's a very important report. It was called Honoring the Spirit of Modern Treaties. Honoring the Spirit of Modern Treaties, Closing the Loopholes. In my mind, I always want to call it Honoring the Loopholes. That's not the name of it, so I just wanted to make sure I got it right. It endorsed in many ways the approach and the proposals that LCAC was advancing. But again, you know, it was cast aside by the government of the day. And in fact, while there was ongoing discussions with officials that were often very positive, with the government, the Harper government, there was virtually no progress made in respect of developing a keeping our promises policy. Until the very last days under Minister Bernard Valcourt, to his credit, and supported by people within the department, two very important things happened. The first is, and simultaneously, in July of 2015, there was a cabinet directive that was issued that is a very important, remains a very important document, but it's inward looking. It's establishing various structures within the federal government with the goal of better implementing modern treaties. And simultaneously, the adoption by Cabinet of a statement of principles related to the implementation of modern treaties. That statement of principles remains current. It's adopted by Cabinet, hasn't been reversed or repealed. So it remains there as an important statement of principles. However, alas, since 2015, often lost in the noise of all of the different things that have been happening in respect of Indigenous people broadly. But I recommend especially the statement of principles to you. And then when this government took over, there was a time where we were still having a bit of difficulty getting the ear of the government, but since then I'm very happy to say that there have been significant changes. The Cabinet Directive has not necessarily had all of its desired effects, for reasons I'll speak to in a moment, but there have been changes, no doubt. The federal government has paid far more attention to implementation, to promise keeping. What was once a relatively small branch is now a much more significant and large sector. And I want to say, candidly, it's staffed with dedicated, committed, and intelligent officials who are working very, very hard to make things better, and I want to acknowledge that and thank them for it. CERNA has made a lot of effort, but nonetheless, there still hasn't led to the kinds of improvements that we had hoped for in 2015. It hasn't been enough, in other words, because there is still, despite the efforts of the team that I was just talking about, and CERNA generally, there remains in other federal departments and even places within CERNA and ISC, a profound lack of knowledge about the existence of modern treaties, the importance of modern treaties, the necessity for modern treaties to inform everything that they think, say, or do that might affect modern treaty. Indigenous people have modern treaties across so much of this country. People who have entered into modern treaties have taken a monumental step. And the problem with the distinctions-based approach that only separates Indigenous people into First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, without recognizing the distinction that exists between people who've entered into modern treaties and those who haven't, is not getting the distinctions right with respect. And too often, officials in other departments, not the ones I was talking about, they're doing their best to educate their colleagues, but too often in the other departments, and sometimes within CERNA and ISC, officials blur together all Indigenous people. They treat modern treaty rights as just another flavor of Indigenous rights on the Baskin and Robin list. You know, you've got historical treaty rights, would you like that one? Or you've got asserted rights, got those over there. You know, there's this menu of rights, and modern treaty rights are just another flavor of Indigenous rights, which leads to a lowest common denominator approach. Sometimes they're equated with asserted rights. Sometimes they're equated with statutory rights. But modern treaties, I suggest, are exceptional in many ways. Indigenous people who've achieved modern treaties forged them in the crucible of decades of negotiations, of personal and professional strain on the negotiating teams and the political leaders, the strain on the families, the strain on the personalities. The people have had to face existential questions as to how they wish to continue to move forward, to evolve and prosper, to enter into an agreement while maintaining and enhancing their cultures, their languages, and especially their relationship to their land. They have had to compromise and make profoundly difficult decisions in a way that really does set them apart from others who make assertions but have not gone through that crucible or haven't had the chance to. And after all of that, it's been so distressing to have to fight to get the promises kept, to fight to not have the promises nickeled and dimed down to the lowest common denominator, to fight to get other departments to even recognize the exceptional nature of modern treaty rights.
There we go.
And that's why a policy is still needed. That will be outward-facing as well as inward-facing, that tells the Canadian body politic about the importance of modern treaties, that informs everything that departments do, not simply as a bureaucratic set of measures, but indeed a high-level political direction that we mean to keep our promises, and here's our policy for how we're going to do it. You see, modern treaties have this funny I call it a triple aspect. They're contracts between the Indigenous signatory and the Crown, they're statutes, they're given the force of law, and they're lists of constitutionally protected rights. This is why they can't be reduced to programs and services and cannot be diminished in any way. So I know my time's up. I just wanted to say that in conclusion, right back in 2003, when the request for a policy was first enunciated by leaders, everybody knew that a policy wasn't the end of the road. It's not a panacea. It's not something where, oh, okay, that's done. Rather, the policy is the framework for going forward under which the hard work will continue, but we think that a policy will make it that much better. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aldrich. We now call upon Mr. Johnson from the Tleaman First Nation, elected leader.
Mr. Tleaman. My cousins over here, my sister and others from Tleaman are laughing about that, so that's good. Never lived that one down. Aja Chepot, good morning everybody. Tokwanan kwatnan tawach Tleaman. Imut kwat kwaigan kwat kwananape. Checha Tanapech, Algonquin, Anishinaabe, Kaimuch, Asna te Egija. Hauch Kayu smote. That one's for them too. It's been quite a journey to get here, but I'm so glad I made it on time. And it's so awesome to see some faces I haven't seen in, well, 3 years. And look forward to getting to know some new folks too. So I'm Dylan Johnson. My Tleaman name is Tokwanan. I'm a member of our executive council at the nation. Prior to my stepping back into politics, I was involved in fiscal negotiations, other negotiation of implementation issues for my nation. And today I wanted to provide some, I guess, experience, some kind of realities on the ground sort of thing that our nation is dealing with. Tleaman, is there a clicker or what's the, Thanks. There we go. Yeah, great. Just to orient everybody to where we're located, we are just north of Vancouver. I think everybody will know where Vancouver is. It's called the Sunshine Coast, but it rains 300 days a year. But, bit of a misnomer, and it probably would have been quicker to drive here, honestly, but based on my experience. But yeah, I think we're still the latest or the most recent modern treaty that was signed in Canada, and our effective date was April 5th, 2016. So we're still very much just getting our feet under us in terms of implementing and trying to, stretch our legs in terms of the treaty. I'm going to go through a bit of some of the internal stuff we struggle with, and some of the external stuff we face with our treaty partners, and talk about something we're working on currently. So it's a bit of a confusing figure here, but I just wanted to point out that this is the new structure we adopted, and it's in our Constitution, it's in our Government Law Elections Act, and it's, this structure is, captured in all different laws and regs and policies and so forth. And the top left Legislative Assembly is what people elect, 9 citizens. Of those 9 citizens, 5 become the Executive Council. Executive Council is like our cabinet. It's the day-to-day, more, busy, I guess, and more control of the affairs of the nation. And there's 4 people that aren't on Executive Council that are on the Legislative Assembly. And I wanted to just touch on a bit of the, it's an implementation issue, is that there's some tension, between our executive and our legislature. Because people were used to, previously, it's an Indian Act band, 1 chief, 11 councillors, big table, right? But everybody's there every meeting, privy to all the same info, and it made for a less efficient decision-making structure. 2-year cycle too, right? Like that wasn't very productive. But today, getting used to this new system, already people who feel left out are getting cold feet about the whole structure and are saying at every General Assembly, actually we just had one last week, it was raised again, we elect 9 folks, how come we don't have equal representation of the people we elect? And what I've been saying, and there's a lot more work to be done, like I'm not married to this, like there's obviously going to be improvement along the way as we go, like it's not like we got everything right out of the gate. But we're still, like I said, just getting our legs under us, and we have to see how it works. There's not enough, I guess, of a track record of operating under this to really throw out the baby with the bathwater and say we're going back to the Indian Act. And what I've also been saying is, when people voted on the treaty, they voted for change, and and this didn't happen by accident. So let's give it a real effort here to see if we can, get used to it a little bit and make some changes. 'Cause there's a lot of theory behind the structure, right? You got your legislatures, executive group, and so forth. But that's just one of those things you deal with, I think, as a modern treaty nation, is the change. And I think everybody's seen this in some form or another. Who wants change? Everybody wants change, but nobody wants to change. Reminds me of something my cousin told me, which was a hilarious joke. And he said, there's 2 things people hate the most around here: the way things are and change. Love that one. So yeah, this is just to the first bullet there. Like, there's a lot of work that was done, obviously, to set up our laws, policies, the whole regime. But even the ones that were involved with the approval of these pieces and stuff still kind of like aren't quite fully accepting of it now in implementation. And so now they want to go back to the Indian Act the way they were familiar with. So it's just something we'll have to contend with over time and improve things. But yeah, it's a reality we have to face when coming up to change, and maybe more of an effort around change management might have avoided some of the or smoothed over some of these bumps we're facing. Perhaps some of the stuff that Jim was talking about, our treaty, I often say, like, we might, because we get our own people saying, were we even ready for this treaty? Like, as we struggle with some of these things, but I always say, like, we might not have been fully ready, but I think we were more ready than Canada and BC were on treaties, because we run into, like, the promise of the treaty. Our government partners have, a lot of trouble with that. They just, can't seem to really implement a whole of government approach to dealing with modern treaties. And it's even just down to the basic level of understanding which nations, are treaty nations. And there'll be more, if you want to hear me complain a lot more on that one, I'm in a breakout session tomorrow, so I'll save some of my criticisms for that. But also, like, the broader public too, they don't really recognize. Like, there's the folks around, the local area who, oh yeah, this treaty, that's really great, but they, they don't really understand what it actually means, and others take a really poor view on treaties. It's like, it's that whole, oh, you guys are done. Like, we've gone through a couple of initiatives with our neighboring governments, the broader community. One of which is to try to change the name of the municipality, which was a bit controversial. And the other is we're trying to reclaim our former village site, which wasn't part of the treaty because it was already private land, but it's for sale and we're trying to reclaim it. But like a lot of the folks, in the town, are, well, you have a treaty, you're done. Like, this is, it's the divorce kind of mentality. Whereas it's, there needs to be more awareness out there that a treaty is the start of a new relationship that's going to evolve and keep growing, not a sever of relations. And you guys got your piece over there, now shut up and be quiet. No, that's not what it's supposed to be, right? On the positive side, there's some really good stuff going on. The recent policy changes, I'm not going to steal Daniel's thunder, I think, a big announcement today, but in addition to that, there's been some other policy changes. Obviously the collaborative fiscal work has really helped us build out our nation more, and gap closing funds and so forth. We're able to finally start to change the face of the nation thanks to better fiscal mechanisms. Because the first 4 years of implementation, there wasn't a whole lot to show for it, and I feel like just in the past 4 years, we've made great strides in living up to the promise of the treaty. Also, because of the new structure, we have our tensions and so forth, but we have been demonstrating a lot more stability and better decision-making, in my view, and we've been able to attract a lot of our skilled and experienced people coming home to help, whether on staff, consultants, and committees, and all the different institutions. Prior to the last 4 years, I would say, like, a lot of those folks would be like, too dysfunctional, I'm not going to come work for home or come back home, and I think we're starting to turn the corner on that one for sure. Famously, our treaty vote was really, or actually our whole treaty experience was very divisive. Families is almost 50-50, this way, that way, this way, that way. And our treaty ratification vote was blockaded on the first attempt, national news and all this stuff. But now that, that question has been settled and we're kind of all moving forward, I feel like a lot of the division along those family lines have been kind of squashed. And we're able to work a lot better together. And I think everybody who wants a job, school, training, starting their own business, there's a lot more opportunity for folks based on the programming and stuff we've been able to bolster. But so the cash, we can set up a trust. It can help entrepreneurs. So it's there's a lot of aspects to be really happy about. Okay, I'll be real quick. Okay, finally, I've only got 2 minutes to talk about this, but it's kind of a big deal for us because. As I mentioned, there's been policy kind of advancements in the, I guess, the treaty making and reconciliation agreements and so forth. Some of the stuff we want as the nation want to incorporate into our modern treaty. So calling it like modernizing our modern treaty sort of thing. But it's just that during the days, the Dark Harper days, that was when our treaty came into effect. And it was, cede and surrender, extinguishment, obviously Section 87 expiry, these things that our community really we wanted to get out of the Indian Act, but those were huge compromises. And it was kind of plug your nose and swallow just to get out from under the Indian Act. But for now, we have the opportunity to update the treaty to reflect the new kind of living agreements approach that federal policy and province of BC policies allows for. And as well, we're going to incorporate, hopefully, some Ayajuthem, some of our language into the treaty. Our treaty is quite absent of our language, and we want to make that a lot more visible. Yeah. And yeah, I think that's my time. So thanks very much. Look forward to connecting with everybody here. Imot.
See how far that mic has to go up? I look more coastal than he does. He looks like some of those tall Cree people that come, in the grasslands. They have to be able to look over. Funny, our trees are taller on the coast, but we're all, we're a little bit close to the ground. Thank you very much. That was insightful. Really, really neat to see, the emergence of a new nation. It's kind of almost a time traveling piece, right? Champagnat again, our First Nation, 30 years. So to go back and see how you're like, okay, well, we think this government will work and this government will work. Sorry to tell you, I spent 8 years sort of revamping the government. But I think if you continue to keep on that track, I think your people will be there and you will be better for it. So thank you very much for that presentation. I now call upon, I'll have my speaking notes from now on. So, Miss Bertha Rebeska-Zo from the Clecho government.
Good morning. Did come to Honsi, Masi, Zwazongo he, Dakwe, Ayon goes a dasi, Clehe goes a dwaga, Asi, who did a twaga, and it's in this Yazamasi. Good morning. My name is Bertha Rabiska-Zo. I'm grateful to be up here, to be able and given an opportunity to address the conference. I just said that it's good to have everybody here. We're all here to learn and learn from each other and to come up with ideas and solutions on the work that we're on right now. I'm Clinchon. I speak my language. I'm also a lawyer, and I currently work within the Clinchon government as the Director for Department of Planning and Partnership, a role that I've held for just over a year. This morning somebody said, there's probably quite a bit of lawyers in here. 20 years ago, I finished law school and my articling job, and for most of articling students know what kind of work you do as an articling student, but my job as an articling student was to shut down the Dogger Band and the Dogger Treaty 11 Council and create Clinchon government overnight. That was my job. And I was very privileged, honored, and humbled to be given this type of work by Rick Salter and Arthur Pape from Pape Salter Teye. Many of you in the land claim business and Aboriginal rights business know who they are. And I also took Native Studies and Political Science at university, so I got an opportunity to use this knowledge to work with elders in our region and leadership to help set up Clinchon government. And I was the first interim Clinchon executive officer, which is the highest position within Clinchon government, on an interim basis on effective date. So I've been involved in implementation for about 20 years now. One of the tasks given to me was to get our agreement through Parliament. That was another articling job I had. So the chiefs dispatched me, that's the word they use. We'll just dispatch Bertha to Ottawa and get our agreement through Parliament. And so it was quite a task, but it was fun stuff because as it happened, Chrétien was proroguing Parliament at that time, and there was a big Liberal leadership convention going on. So the chiefs sent me to Toronto to lobby Paul Martin, who we knew was going to be the next prime minister, and I met him wherever I could at the Liberal Convention. Finally, after the fourth meeting, catching him here and there, I went to the Aboriginal Commission, and I got in line for a speaker, and he was there. And when I got to the mic, he says, "Yeah, I know what you want. Don't worry, you got my support." So I was telling my children that, and I said, "Yeah, I was in Ottawa, Toronto, trying to meet with Paul Martin here and there, and trying to get our agreement approved or supported." And my daughter says, "Oh, so you're stalking the next Prime Minister of Canada?" So I just wanted to mention the coalition for a little bit, because the coalition is a very important vehicle. It's an agreement of all land claim bodies to come together to talk about issues of common concern that affect us all. The leaders meet once a year, which is this Thursday. The leadership does meet once a year. Probably many people wonder what we do at the coalition. But as officials, we meet every month on a monthly basis by Zoom for years. And we've got Envision managing all of our work in our meetings. So for those of you that don't know how the inner workings of the LCAC works, that's how we've been working for years. It's a coalition. It's not an organization. It's not a corporate entity, but a willingness of all of us to work together. And so a big shout out to Patty Black and her team, and they've been great and wonderful for all of these years and continue to do excellent work. So I've been working on developing implementation of the agreement, of the Cleachon Agreement, my entire career, as I've said. The land claim agreement is a combination of land claims and self-government. As many of you know, it takes a lot of work to implement modern treaties. And I've been told many times that negotiation is the easy part, and implementation is where all the work is, and they're not kidding for sure. So the Cleachon are Indigenous people that live, and I've got a map here. How does that work?
How do we get the map up?
The green?
They just need to feed.
Right there. Oh, what did I do? I did something. Okay, but somebody can sort that out. But I have a map of the Cleachon area. And so the Cleachon are Indigenous people that reside in the traditional territory of Mufi-Guadenitle, which in 1921, so the Cleachon Agreement is built on the treaty that was signed in 1921 by Mufi, who was the Cleachon leader at that time. So the previous map, if you can. So the Mufi territory is a vast area, as you can see here. The northern shores of Great Slave Lake and into the Decho, southern part of the Great Bear Lake and into Contueto Lake, which is in Nunavut. This is the traditional territory of the Cleachon. And within that, the next one, you know how to do that. Okay, within that is Cleachon lands that the Cleachon own. This is the 39,000 square kilometers of land that the Cleachon own, surface, subsurface. And I know Delaney likes to brag that they're the home of hockey, right? But if you look at that upside down, it's a hockey player. So we have it etched in our land that is there. So that's Cleachon lands. It's about half the size of Nova Scotia. And so the treaty sets out the vision on how we will live together and work together. So it's up to us as treaty partners to bring that vision to life. We've made great progress, and I'm looking forward to speaking more in the next couple of days about some of the issues and solutions that's been coming up for the Cleachon. First is the ability of Cleachon government to exercise our treaty jurisdiction, which is fundamental to the promise of self-government for the Cleachon. However, we have faced some obstacles. The main obstacle relates to a lack of fiscal resource and capacity challenges that Cleachon government faces when it comes to fully exercising our lawmaking authorities. We want to educate our own children. We want to take control of the program that support our most vulnerable. People have been trying to do this for us for 100 years, but they haven't done a good job, because this is fundamentally what it means to be Cleachon. We have the best chance of taking on these problems and finding the solution that work for our communities. Another one is relating to shared jurisdiction. Again, the Klintron operate in a totally unique and complex regulatory scheme for management of lands and resources. And these are very challenging. As you can see, the North is quite different from the rest of Canada. We have several land claim bodies and unsettled areas, and those are still negotiations. Two of us have land claim self-government agreements, and some are negotiating self-government agreements. So it's a pretty complex landscape in the Northwest Territories than the rest of Canada. So trying to manage the regulatory scheme for the North can be challenging at times, but we feel that it's working so far. And the North is in the forefront of collaborative drafting of lands and resource legislation. The Northwest Territories, and I think this is, I know it's not on an implementation level, at the territorial, we're making some significant progress where we're working directly with GNWT, the territorial government, on co-drafting key pieces of lands and resources legislation. I don't think any Indigenous government anywhere in the world has done that, where you sit down and draft legislation for a government. We've been able to do that through a protocol that we have a protocol to do that, and now we're working on a protocol with the Legislative Assembly. Once the legislation goes through the Legislative Assembly process, we have a protocol. And so, which is, I think, a huge significant thing that we're doing in the Northwest Territories. As an example, we co-drafted the UNDRIP legislation in the Northwest Territories. So the other thing is that the need for better data. Data is a thing that as treaty partners we need to do a better job at in trying to fill in the gaps so that we have a robust data collection for everything that we do. And that takes a lot of resources and building capacity as well. Remoteness is also another implementation concern because especially in the fiscal policy stuff, how we look at how one Indigenous community is different from the other, and some of us are regionally based and many are community based, so there's different approaches that need to be considered. So through the work that we're doing at the Modern Treaty Implementation through the LCAC, the work is still very important, and there's a new announcement coming out as we've been told today. We're very looking forward to that. That has been in the works for 20 years, as Jim has mentioned. And I wanted to do a last-minute reflection as I was reading my speaking notes. I've skipped over a lot, it's quite technical, but I wanted to raise the issue of distinction-based approach that the Government of Canada has taken, especially funding for First Nation. I think some of the distinction-based approach is working, like in the Inuit case, they're all working together, so that's really working well for them, but for the First Nations is not. And why we say that is because there are federal, provincial, territorial tables that we all know of that these meetings are held at the very high level where various issues that impact our lives are discussed. And the national Indigenous organizations are invited to sit at these tables. And I'm especially concerned about how Canada allows the Assembly of First Nation to sit at the table. And we all know that as land claim bodies and governments that they don't speak for us, that they're not our voice. We speak for ourselves. And so they discuss and make decisions in the areas of health, Indigenous language, housing, education, to just name a few. I have a list of those different tables, and there's over 10 of them. And at LCAC, we always say there's a fourth distinction, the land claims agreements. So let's not lose sight of that and make sure that our treaty partners deal directly with us and not use the AFN and the distinction-based approach to address treaty obligations. As Jim said, And as Jim said, Canada needs to get the distinction right, and those are modern treaties, and that modern treaties are exceptional. So with that, I wanted to add that in because they have to get that extension. My understanding from talking to some of my territorial colleagues is that, as an example, Canada is putting, I don't know, $2 billion in healthcare funding, and how much of that is going to, AFNS at the table talking about divvying that up, but we're not at those tables to talk about how that should directly to land claims and self-government. So I look forward to the discussions we will have over the next coming couple of days, and to learn from all of you as we move this ship forward, or this boat that we're on forward. So with that, masicho.
Thank you, Ms.
If this were the Oscars, the
Zope. I now call upon esteemed colleague Daniel Kwan Watson to make his presentation. Hopefully it's good.
Un grand plaisir d'être ici parmi vous aujourd'hui pour la première fois depuis plusieurs années. A great pleasure to be in the same room with so many of you after so many years away. Great to see so many familiar faces in the room, great colleagues, friends, partners in the treaty journey that we're all on. I have to admit I'm a little disappointed to see Jim Aldridge here in Ottawa today. Usually I say to my office, I need to talk to Jim Aldridge immediately. They say he's in New Zealand and it's 3 a.m. and I just say, tell him it's urgent. And I have contacted him at places all around the world, always at about 3, 4, or 5 a.m. So the fact that he's here in Ottawa means he's actually able to do business during regular business hours. So sorry I wasn't able to disturb your sleep again. Treaties are about rewriting an incorrect understanding of Canadian Confederation. It's unrevisionism. Revisionism is, of course, when you tell the history of something a way that suits a particular purpose. And the way many of us, certainly of my age, were taught about Confederation is that Canada was created by two founding peoples, the French and the English. There isn't a person in this room that doesn't understand that that was never within 10 million light years of the truth. There's absolutely no point to establishing Port Royal in 1605. There's absolutely no point to establishing Quebec City in 1608 or Montreal in 1642. There's no point in La Vérendrye traveling to what's today known as Winnipeg. There's no point in setting up the Fort Edmontons of the world or the Fort Hopes of the world or any of these other places if it isn't for the enormous contributions, the enormous wealth brought to this country by Indigenous peoples and what they did. There's absolutely no point for any of those arrivals and any of those people staying here. And yet, when we wrote the history of this country in the history books that so many of us understood, if you go to the parliamentary precincts and look at much of what's told there about the creation of Canada, with the exception of the establishment of the Indigenous people space, which for the first time in the history of this country will establish a space that says clearly to all Canadians and everybody who looks at the parliamentary precincts that Indigenous people too were crucial to the founding of what we understand as Canada today. Except for that space, the Indigenous presence is very sparse because of the way that we told that story in this country for over a century and a half. Treaties actually told the story about how Confederation actually happened, how Canada was actually built. And what it said is that Indigenous peoples were full partners in that relationship, full partners in the creation of what the relationship was that we were going to have going forward. Now, each of the three previous speakers has pointed to many shortcomings in the ways that we have operated in that relationship since we began them. If we had the numbered treaty people here, if we had the Douglas Treaty people here today, they would tell many histories that would have far too many similarities with what has been described here today. But there are, I think, a number of very hopeful signs. Hopeful signs not to be confused with a declaration of victory or having achieved everything that we need to do. Now, I'm in part the warm-up band today because despite what Dylan said, I'm not going to give the best news of the day. The minister is going to do that shortly. But I do want to talk about a couple of things. You're never organized to answer a question you don't know that you have. The NISCA referred since 1887 at least to what they described as being the land question. And in the 1970s, when the James Bay power projects were being built, for the first time after the Calder case in 1973, Canada understood, the federal government understood, that it needed to answer land questions in northern Quebec. Had no machinery to do it, had no understanding how to do it, and so invented a machinery to produce agreements. And that took us through probably the first 15 years of the approach to building those relationships. We had machinery that could actually go out and produce agreements. But what we didn't do at the same time was build the machinery to actually deliver on the commitments that we had made. And that was borne out in a number of very unfortunate cases that were brought to courts and dispute resolution, and where it was demonstrated very clearly that the federal government had fallen short on those fronts. And we've made some steps there. We've made some important steps. As has been referenced, we now have an implementation sector. It's headed by an assistant deputy minister, Heather McLean, who's in the room, a dedicated team spread out across the country. My very first job ever in the treaty business was with the government of British Columbia as the director of implementation for the province of British Columbia for every single treaty negotiation there. And I remember applying for the job, and it was a 9-page job description, and my conclusion was, you actually have no idea what you want this job to do you? And they said, no, that's pretty much right, you're going to have to figure it out. Again, we didn't have the machinery in place at that time to actually deliver on the things that we needed to do in the way that we needed to. But what you've pointed out to today, and more importantly, over many, many, many years of critically important joint work that has reached a significant milestone, you've pointed out to us that we also don't have the machinery in place to manage the relationships that we have always said that we were creating when we rewrote correctly this time the nature of the Canadian Confederation by putting it down into words in treaties. And that is the next major step. A couple of things that we have done on that front is that we have done the work on the modern collaborative fiscal framework. That's incredibly important. When I was at negotiating tables in the 1990s, a lot of the financing conversations were around, well, this is what you had as a band council, why would you need any more? And yet the black and white text says that all of these decisions that were previously made by other governments, all of these indecisions that were allowed to be indecisions with enormously negative impact on Indigenous peoples because there was nobody empowered to make those decisions, were also not being financed. And the modern collaborative fiscal framework allows us to undo that gap and to make significant strides, and we will continue to do that. The cabinet directive that has been pointed to has been an important step. What it has allowed those in the system and the federal side to bring to requirements that other departments engage is an enormous step different from what we've had in the past. You've reminded us again and again and again that that's insufficient, and we've heard you on that front, and within the hour, we should have an answer for you on it. We also have the Deputy Ministers Committee, Oversight Committee on Implementation. And this is a committee at which I convene every deputy minister in the entire federal government, including those who don't usually think about themselves as being engaged on Indigenous issues. And often we hear from you, and many of you have come, and those have been transformational experiences for many of my colleagues. But they've also been opportunities to hold each other to account for the things that we don't see. I do think there is time that we reconsider the concept of implementation. Implementation is in itself a term about something that is finite. You can say that you have implemented something. Normally, when we're building a building, when we're building a road, when we are drafting a document, we complete that thing. We must never allow ourselves to think of having completed treaties. We might complete the negotiation, we might complete the amendment, but that is only the beginning and must always be understood to be the beginning and the beginning only. Now, by show of hands, how many federal public servants are there here? Quite a few. This part's for you. Some homework. And I've said this to your deputies at the Deputy Ministers Oversight Committee. I want you to think of 3 items that your department did last year, randomly. The only limitation is they can't have the word Indigenous in them, or First Nation or Métis or Inuit. They have to be things that your department just did, had some broader impact. Question about those 3 things is I then want you to think about 3 treaties at random. Put them all in a hat if you want, pull them out, do it any way you want. And I want you to go and find out in your department, how did your department on those 3 items you've identified test the impact of what you did on those 3 treaties that you guessed at random, to make sure that what you were doing was in line with those treaties. And I want you to ask that question all the way up to the top of your department. Because if you don't have the answer to that, you can't be implementing treaties as effectively as you need to. Second piece of homework. I want you to pick 3 treaties at random. Preferably 3 different ones, but they don't have to be 3 different ones in the first piece of homework. And the question is, how did we assess the distinct aspects of those 3 treaties and the spirit intent of those 3 treaties, not treaties in general, those 3 treaties against whatever it is that you did last year on those 3 topics that I talked about? Or better yet, go to your regional office where those treaties operate most directly and ask the question for 3 things that you did last year. How did you assess against those specific treaties the spirit and intent? And if you don't like the answer that you find, if it isn't specific enough, raise it inside your department to the point that you get a different answer. Because if you're not considering those treaties specifically, if you're not considering the specifics of the spirit and intent of each of those 3, then you cannot be implementing those treaties, to use that terminology, as effectively as you have. And the final piece of homework is this. for my federal colleagues. The previous initiatives I was talking about, I all said they're limited to non-Indigenous initiatives. This one is about ones that are specifically labeled as Indigenous, and it goes to the point that each of our partners here has raised today. And it is what is the language that you are using in your department to explain the difference between modern treaty holders and quote-unquote Indigenous. And if you can't find specific language, develop it, use it, ensure that it is considered in those decision-making processes. Because I think it is an incontrovertible reality that if you cannot and are not explaining that, you cannot possibly be implementing these treaties in the way that we always intended that they would. So I'll conclude my remarks here with thanks to all those of you who continue to work with us, who continue to offer your sometimes blunt assessments, ones that we always appreciate. But most importantly, thank you for your continued dedication to the relationship that we all agreed that we created in these treaties and for holding us to account to it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that. Again, raise our hands to Mr. Jim Aldrich, Mr. Dylan Johnson, Ms. Bertha Rebecca Zoe, and Mr. Daniel Juan Watson. Thank you for sharing your story. As most of you who are in the implementation phase of your land claim and self-government agreements still, there are many challenges, and so it is refreshing to see that there are people on the other side of the table who are as embedded within this quest as we are. And so with that, one final thank you to the four speakers.